people who are aspiring to be or are currently involved in philanthropy, you have to think horizon. We have to create something that will stand the test of time and play a role in shaping the struggle for sovereignty. So I understand that all of humankind, there's histories of how we've come back from terrible situations. Study those things and then look at the horizon and figure out what you can do in the present.
Hi, this is Brandolon with Giving Compass, and I am so pleased and honored to be here in conversation with Judith LeBlanc, founder and executive director of Native Organizing Alliance. Judith, it's great to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you.
This podcast, this journey that we're starting, this learning series really, is about diving deeper into a lot of causes that aren't necessarily as well known so that we can shine a spotlight on the amazing work that you and others like you are doing. And so we're so grateful to have you today. And on that note, I think a great place to start is would love for you to just tell us about NOAA and its overall mission.
Well, NOAA was founded out of the grassroots mobilization to support the Affordable Care Act. I was not the founder. I have been the executive director of Native Organizers Alliance for 8 years. We have grown in these last 8 years, and both in the sense of the issues we work on and the people we work with, but our mission has remained the same, which is to do whatever is possible to build the capacity of tribes, tribal communities, and Native communities in urban areas to build power, to exercise their power on policies, on the conditions in which we live. That is our mission. Our work, it's really very grassroots driven. Tribal communities, tribal leaders, Native leaders will come to us and say, hey, we need help on this or that. Or what do you think we should do about this or that? We are invited. We work in a very traditional way. We don't go into communities unless invited. We follow a traditional and spiritually led strategy, which is to understand that all things are in relationship. And so if we're working on the protection of salmon on the Snake River, for example, we know that it is important to connect that struggle with the work that's going on in Alaska on the protection of salmon, because we are all in relationship. And the climate crisis has ignited in some ways the urgent necessity to build bonds and to share experiences and practice between tribal communities. And so our issues driven by the grassroots. So for example, we do work on the protection of sacred sites. We knew there was an opportunity when the Biden administration came into office to spark a whole new level of policymaking in order to protect sacred sites, which have been under threat for a very long time. But communities all over Indian country were working to protect their sacred places, but they never had the opportunity to come together and leverage that grassroots organizing to have impact on the federal government's policies. So we worked with community groups, Native community groups, tribal nations, and organized, along with other allies in the environmental justice movement, a national road trip called the Red Road to DC, where we were invited by traditional Lummi carvers to bring, as a symbol of this work to protect sacred sites, a 25-foot, 5,000-pound totem to DC to remind the Biden administration of their ancestral responsibilities to protect sacred sites, that they too have a stake in protecting those things that are not only sacred, but also form part of the history of the U.S. And so we're working on sacred sites. We're working with a number of different communities. We've worked with Bears Ears Coalition, Utah Diné Bakayr. We're currently working on protecting the sacred salmon on the Snake River. We also do quite a bit since 2018 on voter protection and voter engagement. 2020, It showed how important it is for our communities to be organized and express their concerns within the electoral arena. We also run a very robust training program where we're building the capacity of tribal leaders, Native community leaders to be strategic, to develop strategies that are rooted in our spiritual teachings and therefore able to nation build, and therefore in order to heal some of the damage that has come by being the object and the victims of systemic racism and the long-term impact of colonialism.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few times how you're bringing traditional values and views of organizing and connecting to communities into the work. Can you talk a little bit more about that and specifically how you're building power among different tribes and grassroots movements? You've done amazing work with all of these different programs, but really curious about your philosophy there.
In the organizing community in general, there is a concept that has trickled down since the 1970s that Saul Alinsky discovered organizing in South Chicago. But that's like Columbus discovering Plymouth Rock. The truth is that tribal nations have been organizing since dirt, since our very beginnings. There's no other way to explain how we as peoples, over 500 tribes, many languages, many traditional ways, there's no other way to explain why we have continued to not only exist, but to grow and to become even more grounded in our traditional ways in the 21st century. So if you want to be effective as an organizer, then you have to understand and find a path for how we use our greatest strengths, our traditional stories, our spiritual, our value system in order to bring our community together to make change possible, transformational policy changes, and to look at the structural reforms that are necessary in order for us to achieve sovereignty. In each community, there are always people who respond to crises. There are tribal leaders who understand the historic mission of regaining and moving towards sovereignty. But it takes a lot. You can't only rely on values and good intentions. You have to have skills. And you have to base those skills on how does a Pueblo community come together? Where are the places? How is it done? How does my tribe, the Caddo tribe of Oklahoma, I'm a citizen of the Caddo tribe nation of Oklahoma. How have we come together? There's a lot of similarities between tribal nations and Native communities. Food is at the center of every gathering, but also the ways that we speak to one another. So when we do a training program, in a given community, we rely on those in the community to guide how to present some concepts so that they can explore what it means to talk one-on-one with someone, to ask them to become involved in campaigning.
That's amazing. I think our audience would love to hear a personal story or moment to illustrate that dynamic and why the work that you're doing is so crucial, if you're willing to share.
Yes, I have been really blessed to come into this work, being the executive director of Native Organizers Alliance, the year before Standing Rock happened. A Standing Rock was a gathering of hundreds of nations. The largest number of nations came together in support of the sovereign right of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe to protect their water supply, to say no to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what exploded there was an amazing gathering of urban and reservation Indians, 10,000 plus strong, who for many months sat together and exercised their power through direct action and the building of really a platform to express how our traditional teachings and our relationship to the natural world is a guide for the 21st century. When I was there on the ground, there were times, especially in September and October, where almost every day at sunset, when it's golden, I would find myself in the camp with many teepees. There were many tribes that had their own camps, and it was the first time that the Osheti Shikoan tribes had come together since the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And so each tribal nation had their own camps serving delicious foods, some foods I'd never had before. But I would find myself at that time of sunset thinking, oh my goodness, I feel so at peace. I feel so whole. I could hear music and drums coming from many different directions. I could hear children laughing and dogs running with dogs. I could see the children playing with the horses. And of course, the basketball court. That's our favorite sport, b-ball. But I also could feel this sense of a renewal of understanding of what our critical role is in the 21st century. Now, the truth is that feeling of wholeness is a reflection of the entire political moment, not just in Indian country, because Standing Rock would not have happened had not Black Lives Matter, the Fight for 15, the fast food workers who were taking place, the Dreamers, all of these movements were in a flow, were creating new norms of social struggle, how to raise our voices, how to show our power, our collective power. So it was our opportunity. When the Dakota Access Pipeline was proposed and the tribe needed our support, it was our opportunity to stand in that flow of mass movements who had to take a stand that perhaps might be unpopular, but would wake up and interrupt the dominant narrative of what kinds of structural reforms are needed in the 21st century, but also the dominant narrative of who Native people are. So that sense of wholeness for urban Indians and res Indians, I'm an urban Indian. I walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other. But for all of us, we felt what sovereignty could look like, how we can work together, how we can actually, if organized, exert our political power. That
And
was
I
an
love that.
important lesson for me.
Yeah. I love that story, and I love the idea that a lot of these different movements by different groups that can seem siloed, exercising their power, exercising their voice, making a case for who the justice system serves or who the systems in power serve. I love the idea that they're all connected and can inspire each other and live together to move us in a better direction. That's a
And
really
you
incredible way, I think, of thinking about it.
and I think for all of the movements that I lifted up that are a part of this bigger desire for the majority to live a better life, these movements in the US ignited global awareness, ignited global movement. When you just look at Standing Rock alone, we had demonstrations in solidarity with us in Okinawa, in France. There were international delegations from the West Bank and Gaza, from Iraq. So I think the way that we conceptualize power building in the 21st century has to be with an Indigenous framework, which is that we are all in relationship. Everything that we do in our own communities has an impact far beyond the immediate. This is a fundamental Indigenous framework, the time continuum. So, therefore, those things in the past, what we hope for the future, is only one place where they come together, and that's in the present. So what we do matters, because what will our descendants say about what we did in this moment of climate crisis? When they look back 30 years from now, what did our elders do? What did our ancestors do? So we have to be guided by what we can bring forward from the past and connected to that horizon goal that we have for saving Mother Earth, for engaging in political power building that can guarantee that we all have a decent life going forward. And I think an Indigenous framework it's so necessary in the 21st century, because if we all understand where we come from, where are we going, so therefore, what is my responsibility in this moment? We'd have different government policies if our elected officials looked at natural disasters that way. If our elected officials or our community leaders said, let's have a discussion about a development project. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is right for us right now in this community?
And you mentioned this, but let's dive deeper into some of the major issues that Native Organizers Alliance is addressing. Specifically, Native led organizations are literally at the forefront of a lot of issues like climate change. Would love to get your perspective on why Indigenous knowledge is so crucial to problem solving in that space.
The answer to that is in the scientific world. There's been so many revelations in the last few years about how some traditional practices, for example, on forests and fires, wildfires, so that there are whole departments on different levels of government that are returning to the traditional ways that we have tended to forests and vegetation. And there was a book that came out, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, by a woman, a scientist, who advanced the theory of how trees in a forest relate to one another, how that ecosystem relates to one another. So you can find one kind of tree growing next to another. And a lot of times in forestry, people will try to strip out, especially if it's for-profit lumber, they'll strip out all the other plants in order to have clear-cut process of harvesting the trees. But in this book, she talked about how one nurtures the other and feeds off the other in nutrients and ways that many scientists had overlooked. So you look at the traditional forestry practices of the Menominee tribe, people come from all over the world. And in fact, Mrs. Biden and Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland was up in Menominee last week touring how that forestry work is done, because it is resilience in action. It's traditional practices that are actually rejuvenating Mother Earth's ability to weather the conditions we are facing right now. I also don't think that many understand that we're not saying that Indigenous knowledge is above all else, but we're also not saying that science is all above else. I just have to say one word, COVID. Science doesn't know what it doesn't know. They didn't know. When you look at how the forecasts around COVID, how to protect our communities happen, the one big aha moment was that the health of people in Wuhan was as important as the health on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There was an aha moment that we're all related. But the truth is that you cannot afford, and this was said in the 1970s by one of our best thinkers and philosophers, Vine Deloria, that you cannot privilege, as a Native person, you cannot privilege Indigenous wisdom over science, nor can we accept the idea that you privilege science over Indigenous wisdom. We have to braid them. We're in a moment, we're braiding, we're community, we're bringing together the best of what we know through practice from the past can solve many problems. So it's not by accident that in the last really 2 decades, every major climate crisis struggle and response to endangerment of the environment has been led by Native peoples in Alaska, in Washington, in South Dakota. And we've been able to galvanize broad coalitions of people, of farmers, of ranchers, of environmentalists, everyday people to support the struggles. And I think we've learned as peoples, and we have developed a leadership that now holds that position of we not only deserve to be at the table, but unless we're at the table, you're going to have a hard time winning, because tribal nations have a legal standing, a special relationship to the federal government. We're legal entities. Yes, sovereignty and tribal nation status is a moral inherent right, but it is a constitutional right. And it is a legal standing that is unlike any other community of color. So if you're talking about protecting water or land or the air, we have what other communities don't, which is the legal, moral, and inherent right to lead that fight, to be the caretakers that our ancestors said we must.
And that is quite a journey, just thinking about the issues of climate justice. And yeah, I myself come from like Oak Cliff, a community of color in the city of Dallas, and it's impossible to protect the land. All of the city dumps get put on one side of the community, and so that idea of having that power to protect the land is really powerful, I think. Can you talk about some of the challenges you face as an organization, focus on power building and what you're highlighting here, which is really native-led organizing, showing the way?
So I think your situation in Dallas really highlights the point that an Indigenous framework for understanding our political and social conditions is not about being Indian. It's about understanding your relationship to place, the history of that place, what that place should and could look like in the future, and taking on that responsibility of doing something in the here and now, that relationship to place, and understanding of that it comes from an Indigenous framework. It's something that all good organizers, and no matter what community, act on. They may not see it as an Indigenous framework, but it is at the heart of what our strategy is. The challenges we face. Well, I think the opportunities and the challenges are outpacing our ability to lead. The largest influx of money ever in history of U.S. government came into Indian country as a reflection of the actions of the last session of Congress, the IRA money. For many of our tribes, it created difficulties because we're not used to long-term strategic planning practices when it comes to government funding. We have always lived in conditions of scarcity, governing scarcity of resources, a consistent underfunding of essential human services, treaty rights, consistent scarcity. And so in this moment, the opportunities of applying for various grants for new programs around food sovereignty, regaining buffalo herds, changing the relationship of traditional medicine and Western medicine and how it's practiced in the Indian Health Service clinics, so forth and so on. There's so many opportunities, but our capacity to lead is not up to where it needs to be, given the opportunities. The challenges are clear. The far right in this country they're on the move. They're on the ascendancy yet still. You can see that in Congress and what's going on in Congress. It's about interrupting the rightful role that government plays. And frankly, philanthropy exists because of the tax write-offs which were given. We know the history of that. But philanthropy exists because the federal government isn't fulfilling their role for the people, all the people. We would not need philanthropy if the federal government was playing its rightful role of addressing problems in the economy, social problems, providing the resources for communities to build themselves up and become regenerative centers of not only economic activity, but spiritual and values work that go on in our schools and our community centers. And so the challenge we face, I think, is how do we as government, we're the only peoples that have been self-governing on a collectively owned land base since the beginning of time. We have a lot of experience on democracy. And in fact, if one realizes that the far right is on the ascendancy and the attacks that have begun in the Supreme Court on the Constitution, then natives have to be not only at the table around climate change, but at the table when we're talking about defending democracy and protecting the rights that we have and expanding them so that we can truly have a multiracial democracy. So the challenges we face is that in the social movements, it's not always inclusive of Native voices or experiences. Another challenge we face, and I think all the organizations and movements face, is that I came up in the 70s. In the 70s, when the movements were in a surge, you had people who were still alive who worked on mobilizing the unemployed, the homeless, who helped to found the unions, to draft and fight Social Security and unemployment compensation, built movements, without Zoom, without cell phones and computers. And so those folks, they were elders, but they were able to mentor us, to talk about their experiences, but to understand that the horizon needed people who were strategic. We had study groups. We had a wealth. There were so many different places you could go to be trained in community organizing. It was an amazing time. We do not have that. And this is one of the vital roles that Native organizers plays in Indian country. It is primarily we're the only organization that is running a very robust training program and have for over 10 years. We have trained thousands of community and tribal leaders around the issue of how to build power with strategic, spiritually directed strategic initiatives and tactics, strategy and tactics that conform to our cultures and strengthen our national cultures, and to see the importance of collaboration intertribal and with non-natives. We are training people to think about the problems they face every day, how to reflect on where did we come from, where are we going, what is our role. And we do national trainings a year. We have hundreds of people who apply from all over Indian country for 25 seats because that's all the resources we have. We can do 2 trainings, 20, 25 each, with about 5 trainers that come from community groups that we've trained up as trainers. And we spend 6 days together, smelling each other, making ribbon skirts, telling stories, singing music, and reflecting on what's happening in our communities, what are the structural reforms so that we can have a bigger impact on the federal government's policies, and how it is that we can sustain the power building in between elections. I think one of the other challenges we face is the constant shifting political terrain in order for us to vote. And we are all facing that since 2020. Many repressive voting laws have been passed in states all around the country, but especially concentrated in states where there are large Indian populations, because we're in the places like Nevada, like Arizona, Montana. We are in those places where the right wing is controlling the state legislature and they've passed laws. So we on the ground. In 2020, we had 100 moccasins on the ground in 5 of the 7 battleground states. So what did that mean? That challenge was to get the funding, to get those folks on the ground, to build up the ability of communities from within their communities to get people registered to vote, and to give them the opportunity to reflect on what candidates would do right by Indian country. And as it turns out, the Indian vote was decisive. It was decisive in Wisconsin. It was decisive in Arizona. It was, of course, the collective power of all the swing voters. But the Indian vote is substantial and plays a role because we are in really clear-cut communities where we can mobilize across large areas if we have the resources. So I would say one last thing about challenges and opportunities. We still have very limited opportunities to sit together across communities. And now that's beginning to happen more and more. There was the Lakota Media Conference that just happened a few days ago. There's the annual gatherings, different kinds of cultural gatherings. But we need to organize ourselves as political entities to be recognized and included in policy discussions. And communities, we're not like other communities. We have native urban communities that have leadership, and we have tribal communities with elected sovereign leadership with legal standing. So I think that's one of the challenges in the social justice movements that we face, inclusion, but it's also with policymakers that they're just beginning to realize that, yeah, you have a land base, we better consult you when it comes to development or agreements with fossil fuel industries or other decisions that have impact on the environment, land, water, air.
No, thank you for that. And when you think about those challenges, I'm hearing institutional knowledge and kind of managing that and passing that on. And you're thinking about the rise of forces really undermining our elected government and what it can do, and then capacity to even deal with resources when they come in, and just strengthening the voice and the organizing capabilities. When you think about all those for our listeners, what's a surprising statistic you might share that would give them some perspective on those challenges?
We're in the midst of conducting the third annual Indigenous Futures Survey, which, in partnership with Illuminative, a narrative change group, our sister organization, really. And we are working in 5 of the 7 battleground states to collect data. And this Indigenous Future Survey is the only Indian survey of Indians, period, full stop. Much the government academics have often considered natives as statistically insignificant. So it wasn't until last year under the Biden administration that the Labor Department began collecting unemployment statistics in Indian communities. They had never collected unemployment statistics. They're collecting them now. They haven't released them, but one step. But this Indigenous Future Survey, we initiated it in 2020 to start rattling those cages, to get people thinking about the political significance and role of Native communities, tribal nations. And it showed in 2020, we were the decisive vote that swung things. The exact number of Navajo who voted was the exact number, almost the exact number of votes that Biden got. And that was a slim victory. This survey is a survey of what are the key issues confronting our communities, what is the experience when trying to exercise the right to vote, identity questions, how people see themselves in the larger society. And so this is the third year, but this interesting statistic, I went into a rabbit hole and now I'm coming out of it. The most interesting statistic that we have collected is that over 80% of Native people who say they vote, they look at the voting record or the platform of the candidate. That blew me away. Many of the other statistics that we collected, they conform to our experiences on the ground. But that really made me think there's such an untapped reservoir of political power, because political power is built in between elections. 2020 elections, it was just a snapshot of Native grassroots political power. It's a snapshot of all of our political power. Elections don't change things. They only change the conditions in which we're working. And our people now on the ground in 2023 understand 2024 as being a critical year to reflect all the power and organizing and mobilizing that we've done around issues, to reflect that in the electoral arena. And I think the statistics that you all will see in the turnout will prove that. Because, as I said, Mrs. Biden and Deb were up in Menominee. Well, Menominee, we worked there on the ground with 13 moccasins who are doing voter engagement and GOTV. It was the most infectious place in Wisconsin, Menominee County. There was a 26% increase in turnout from the last national election.
Wow.
So our people risked their lives to organize the vote and mobilize it. And what was the outcome? We pressed right away for the nomination of Deb, the historic breakthrough of having a First Native in the cabinet. And it wasn't smooth sailing. The political leadership was not for it in the transition team. But we organized grassroots pressure. 19,000 people signed a petition within 2 weeks of the transition team being established, and over 200 tribes sent letters supporting Deb. And so we won that struggle, and it has proven to be a structural reform that has created the conditions for structural reforms that cannot be turned back no matter who's in the White House when it comes to governance, land and water management. There's over 60 co-management projects now underway that did not exist between tribal nations and federal agencies. And so I just have such good feelings about the work we're doing, because it has impact, because it has changed federal policies from the grassroots level.
Yeah. And for anyone in the audience not familiar, I think you're referring to Deb Haaland, Secretary of the Interior.
The first Native woman to head up the Department of Interior.
Yeah,
the most
which was a
important department
yeah,
in the government for us.
and a
It
major milestone.
oversees, yep, the Department of Interior oversees governance, natural resources, education, healthcare. It is our department.
And I want to shift the conversation just a little bit in the time we have left. So we have donors who are listening, hearing about the incredible work that you're doing and the perspectives that you bring to the work, and want to help them understand the difference that you're making a little bit more deeply. Can you tell us about a success story where NOAA has made a significant impact that you'd like to share?
Right after Standing Rock, now over 7 years ago, Nosheti Shakoan Elder, who was in the leadership, is in the leadership of a traditional Dakota Women's Society, approached us to help them, their tribe, the Yankton Sioux tribe, regain co-management rights over 115 miles of the Missouri River, which is downstream from Standing Rock. And so we began and continue to work with them. And now, after 6 years, we have a tribal water code that was passed by the leadership. We worked closely with the leadership, closely with the Traditional Women's Society, supporting them in their efforts, creating the opportunities to explore what water codes have done by bringing other tribes together to discuss water codes and the impact on policy and the way that they interact with federal government. And this was not just an administrative project, because in order to conduct such a campaign to establish a water code, which we're in the final stages of, we worked with the Traditional Women's Society to help develop trainings about how do we weave our traditional cultures and our relationship to the river into the necessary scientific basis for the tribe to become a co-manager. So we helped and supported bringing in native and non-native scientists to train grassroots people on how to test water. We had water talks on a number of different reservations that are Missouri River tribes. And we have built up, coming out of the KXL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the work to stop the KXL pipeline, we've built up a circle of people across that state who share a common theory of change, which is that you organize in order to strengthen our national cultures, Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, and we have leaders who've moved from coming to our trainings and being a part of our opportunities to meet with others and from other tribes who now have been either elected to tribal office or helping to initiate some major projects, like in Rapid City, the first ever Indian Center is being founded by one of our trainers. And it all came out of this work on the Missouri River and us building a circle, Osheti Shakoan Circle, in conjunction and supporting and lifting up the leadership of the Traditional Women's Society, the Braveheart Society, who was one of the leads of the No KXL movement, which we won. We won stopping that pipeline because it would have damaged the aquifer, one of the largest inland aquifers in South Dakota. So that is a success story over years. It's little successes. Someone getting elected to another person getting elected to tribal leadership that went through our trainings. The trainings that we've done about community organizing, the ability to bring native and non-native scientists that we knew from around the country to come in and support the tribe, the tribal EPA and the Traditional Women's Society, raising money, doing narrative work around our relationship to water, our natural and traditional relationship to water and that river. And so the Traditional Women's Society is the lead, and we've supported with all of these ways, because we're a national network, we've supported the tribal leadership in skills building. How do you train? How do you do community engagement that's effective based on Dakota culture? And we've also helped them see, how do I use my traditional culture to actually be an organizer of my community? It's an ongoing success story. We're moving it actually into our 8th year, and it's been amazing. It's been an amazing ride.
These are incredible programs, and you're tackling some really urgent issues and making a clear difference. When you think um, about how a donor should think about supporting Native Organizers Alliance, one of the questions I was excited to ask you is why do you think it's crucial for those donors, anyone listening, to act now rather than later?
It's a clear-cut political framework we're all operating in. And that is, I said there were over 60 co-management projects. The one that we're working on in Yankton, we're only working on one of them. And this is creating a model, and the federal agencies we're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife um, and the Army Corps, they realize that this 150 miles of the Missouri River is a special project because we're weaving science with spiritual teachings. We're engaging grassroots community and the tribal leadership. And it's one of over 60, but it is a special one because of that relationship to traditional culture. We could do this in so many other places. We're supporting now the Nez Perce tribe in their struggle to protect the sacred salmon in the Snake River. And the Biden administration is in negotiations around that, but they don't yet have the political will to bridge the 4 dams that have become the problem, the biggest danger to the salmon population. And so we know that if these decisions on, for example, the salmon or other decisions and processes at play in these 60 co-management, the modern day structural reforms to help us move towards sovereignty, these 60 co-management, if we don't seal some deals and make major headway, all of our work will be lost. So the door is closing. The Biden administration will shift into campaign gear, and very few decisions on the executive level and federal department level will be made because they'll be fearful that it will be used as a political football in very tight Senate or congressional or the presidential race. So the door is closing. So if you're going to fund something, fund it now, fund it early, so that we can bring some of these projects that we've been in Indian country, that in tribes and communities have been working on these past few years of opportunity, funded now, funded early. The second thing is, I really think that there are many foundations that have begun to sense this new moment in Indian country, and there's more. And I love the fact that Giving Compass invited me to talk about this work. But I think it is crucial for philanthropy to be inclusive, get guidance from the people who know. Do not parachute into a community and then cherry pick who you're going to fund. That's not going to work. You know why? Because it causes friction. It causes competition in a situation where less than 1% of all philanthropy goes to Indian country. There's fierce competition. Our approach is that we lift up groups like Illuminative or Advanced Native Political Leadership, our candidates training and campaign preparation group, co-founded by Peggy Flanagan, the Minnesota State Attorney General, the only statewide Native uh, officer at this stage. But we're trying to lift up all the groups who are moving with a grassroots political power approach. And you need to consult us. We're more than willing. I know that the Ford Foundation has been going through a process. There's a number of big foundations that are, but we need more of it. Because in order for the funding to be effective, you need people from the ground to give you an assessment of how your investment will and can help.
I think that's so powerful, and it's something that I say a lot as well. And what I find very interesting about it is we don't question it in so many other realms of our lives that if you want to build a good product, you listen to your customers. If you want to build a good business, you listen to your advisors, you listen to your investors. Of course, if we want to build better communities, a better world, we have to listen to the people that live in it in a way that is intentional and thoughtful. And so I think that's a very powerful point. We have just a few minutes left, but I have a couple more questions. I could talk to you actually for much longer. But when we think about that donor that maybe doesn't have money right now, how can they support? Are there current volunteer opportunities? Should they be mailing members of Congress? Just briefly, what are your thoughts there?
I think there's three ways really. One, join our email. We keep it is a constant flow. One of the elders that I know, an elder who did housing organizing in New York City. I saw her recently. I used to live in New York City, and she said, "Judy, I love you. Don't send me an email every day." But we have a very strong email list, over 200,000 and growing. Why? Because we put out there the opportunities to send letters, to sign petitions. We do not send general information emails. We're calling upon the base of people out there who understand the political moment to take immediate action. And it has impact. I gave the example from 4 years ago of the petition that pressed for Deb Collins' nomination to be the Secretary of the Interior. I heard from people in the transition team that it created such an incredible emotional response to have grassroots people intervening in a process that's usually done behind doors. We recently collected, I think, almost 90,000 signatures to ask for clemency for Leonard Pelletier, who's been in life in prison since 1973, 74 during the Wounded Knee occupation. We know that the Biden administration is in deliberations around clemency. We are currently in the midst of a campaign to press for the Biden administration to go further in their commitment to the Columbia River restoration of salmon. They just recently made a decision, and there'll be a lot of money allocated for rejuvenating the salmon in the Columbia River Basin. But part of that problem, the salmon, are the 4 dams on the Snake River. Tens of thousands of people are sending letters, not only to the White House, but also to the Corps of Engineers. So join our e-list. The second thing is, in your own communities, in your work, bring Native and tribal leaders to the table to discuss not just the problems of climate, but economic development, federal election law, whatever issue that you're exploring to fund. Invite people from that arena, those arenas, Native people, to the table to help be more inclusive of the conditions in the country. And lastly, I would say, think about this Indigenous framework concept of how, if you begin to think about life and politics as being all in relationship, far beyond our immediate living conditions, and if you think about the time continuum where you utilize that framework in your decision making, how to invest, it'll be good guidance. I just wish I knew more and felt more strongly the impact of this framework when I was younger, because I wouldn't have so many ex-husbands if I did.
So many things that I wish I knew as well. And that's actually a great segue to what I think will have to be our last question. A lot of our listeners, we're just starting on this journey ourselves, but a lot of the folks listening are aspiring philanthropists. They're folks who want to do more, and they're hopefully using this opportunity with an amazing leader like yourself to learn more about how they can do that. But do you have any advice for that person out there thinking about their philanthropy, thinking about Native organizing and not only what it needs now in its current form, but what it might need 5 years from now? And any advice to share on how they can support that? Just think about their own giving back.
I didn't talk about one of our newest initiatives, which is that on my family's land allotment in Oklahoma, we're going to be building the first ever Native organizing training center. And we're patterning ourselves after the Highland Center to play that role. We do our trainings from place to place, we move it around, but we realize there needs to be a home where people can come and understand that it's not just one training, it's a way living in Indian country to have spiritually directed strategy. And I think that people who are aspiring to be or are currently involved in philanthropy, that you have to think big. You have to think horizon. That's what we're doing with this training center. We could continue to conduct trainings, and we do on reservations, in urban Indian centers, in regions, and then we do our national things. But we realize we have to look to the horizon. We have to create something that will stand the test of time and play a role in shaping the struggle for sovereignty. And if you begin to look at your life that way, what is your horizon goal? Where do you think humanity needs to go in order to achieve a truly multiracial democracy that is actually meeting the needs of community and expanding the possibilities for the way we live in a good way in balance with the natural world? I would also say, dig deep. What are your ancestors? What are their teachings? And I don't mean your grandpa or your grandma only. I consider Nelson Mandela one of my ancestors. So I understand that all of humankind, there's histories of how we've come back from terrible situations. Study those things and then look at the horizon and figure out what you can do in the present, how you'll walk in the present.
Well, thank you, Judith. It has been a real honor and a pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation. Judith LeBlanc is Executive Director of Native Organizers Alliance, and we're so happy that you were able to join us. Anything, just really quickly, how can our users find you? Your website, social, how would you
Yes.
like them to find you?
Please go to nativeorganizing.org. That's our website. And just search on Facebook. We have a very active Facebook page, Native Organizers Alliance, and you'll find us.
Awesome.
And we're
Well,
on
thank you so much.
TikTok and all the hip things that our comms people are young and hip. For those of us who are still a little bit in the 19th century, Facebook website. That's where to go,
Awesome.
nativeorganizing.org.
Everyone's heard it. Thank you so much, Judith, and good luck to you in your work. Thank you for everything that you and your team and your organization and community are doing.
Thank you.